Question: is it wrong to be sad? To be sad. Is it wrong to be sad? Is it wrong to give up? Think about that. All right? Think about that. In Proverbs chapter 22, in verse number 15, the Bible says, "Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him." Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it from him. The rod. God uses the rod and tells us about the rod as far as discipline goes. When my dad was alive and I was a kid, he had a saying, and I thought it was Bible. He said it so many times, I thought he was quoting a verse in the Bible and said, "Spare the rod and spoil the child." How many heard that one before? Just before you got spanked? All right. Brother Wayne, you didn't hear that one? Okay, it's not you. But at any rate, spare the rod. What was the rod? Take your Bibles and come with me to Lamentations chapter 3 as we work our way through this book. Lamentations chapter 3, verse number 1. It says, "I am the man that hath seen affliction by the rod of his wrath." The rod of God's wrath. Does anybody know what God used what the rod was here? What Jeremiah is talking about? Deborah. That's true. Captivity with who? Who put them in captivity? Who was captivating them? Babylon. Okay, so God was using Babylon as his rod. Okay, that's the point I'm trying to get here. God uses different things to get our attention. And in Jeremiah's case and in Israel's case, God allowed Babylon to come in to decimate the city, to destroy the temple, to take the best of the people captive and leave, the weak and whatever else was behind. We can't use these people or whatever. And he had left them behind, so there was a remnant that was there, but the strong ones and the bold ones and so forth, they took the best and took them away. The destruction of the temple and the destruction of this city brought great pain to Jeremiah. Great pain to Jeremiah. We see in Jeremiah chapter 9 in verse number 1, it says, "Oh, that my head were waters, and mine eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughter of my people." Jeremiah wept. That's why he's called the weeping prophet. He wept for Israel, for what God had allowed to happen to Israel, what he had allowed to happen to his temple, but it was because the people had turned their backs on God. And we see in Jeremiah chapter 13 and verse 17, he says, "But if ye will not hear it, my soul shall weep in secret places for your pride, and mine eyes shall weep sore and run down with tears, because the Lord's flock is carried away captive." Because of the people. Because of the people, Jeremiah wept. He's called the weeping prophet. The word weep in the book of Jeremiah is found 6 times, mourn 3 times, tears 5 times, cry 31 times. And I couldn't think of any other synonyms for being sad and all that kind of stuff to look them up, but that's why he's called the weeping prophet. Basically, Jeremiah is the poster child for empathy. He felt for what had happened to Israel. Oh, got a phone going off here. I'm not calling you. All right, I just thought, am I getting something on my hearing aid here? But at any rate, he was a poster child for, like I say, for what had happened and for feeling for others. But I want you to see something about Jeremiah, okay? For 40 years, he had preached to them and told them, you've got to change. 40 years, or plus, over 40 years. He'd said this was coming, and he warned them that it was coming. And what did the people do? They laughed at him. They threw him in a pit. They did all kinds of mean things to him. And eventually what he said happened, and they got taken away into captivity. Now you would think that after saying something for 40 years, over and over and over again in different ways, telling the people, look, you've got to turn back to God. You've got to go back and get your hearts right with God. If you don't, we're going to be hauled off into captivity, and what we have is going to be destroyed. And they didn't listen, and what happened? They got taken into captivity, and everything they saw was destroyed, and the city, the walls were knocked down, and the city, the temple was decimated, and all the gold and everything was ripped out of there, and all the special vessels that they used for worshiping God were all taken out of there. And now everything that Jeremiah had said to them came true. How would the people feel towards Jeremiah? Jeremiah is not the kind of guy that says, well, I told you so. But how did the people feel towards Jeremiah for what he had said to them? I'll tell you. Look at verse 14. Jeremiah, or Lamentations chapter 3, verse 14. It says, I was a derision to all my people, and their song all the day. You know what they did? They made songs about him. They mocked him. Even though what he said was true, they still didn't accept anything that he did. And here he is weeping for these people that are basically spitting in his face and mocking him. Who does that remind you of? Jesus. What Jesus did on the cross, all right? Jesus was treated like mad dogs attacking him. And Jeremiah is in a similar situation. Not as bad as Jesus. But 40 years of preaching and prophesying and warning, and when it comes true, you'd think the light would come on. But instead, we're just going to keep mocking him and keep pushing him away. The physical realm was lost and broken, and nothing familiar that Jeremiah had was not in total ruins. And as long as Jeremiah, if we were to read through this, and we're not going to read it all, but if we were to read through from verse 1 right down to verse 19, we would see that Jeremiah he feels betrayed, because he is by the people, but he even feels betrayed by God. And he is down on what has happened. He is sad, beyond sad, but he is, to answer my first question, is it wrong to be sad? He was sad, but it got terrible. Let's just pick up in verse 17. And he talks about God here, and he says, and thou hast removed my soul afar off from peace. I forgot prosperity. And I said, my strength and my hope is perished from the Lord. Remembering mine affliction and my misery, the wormwood and the gall. Now, wormwood is a plant that is, they use it for some medical stuff there, but it's very, very bitter. And that's what he's saying. The whole taste in my mouth about this whole thing is just terrible bitter. The same with gall. Gall is where we get the root name for our gallbladder, okay? And what's in there is bile. I don't know if any of you have ever been so sick that you're done throwing up your Captain Crunch and your poached eggs and toast, and you get down to throwing up bile. It rhymes with vile for a reason, all right? It is terrible, and the odor from it, and the taste of it, and the whole schmozzle of it. But that's what he's saying here. That's where Jeremiah is at. He says it's bitter, it is vile, and that's where I'm at. That's where I'm at. But you know what's he felt, as I said, like God has turned away. Let's just back up to verse number 7 here real quick. 7 down to 11. He hath hedged me about that I cannot get out. He hath made my chain heavy. Also when I cry and shout, he shutteth out my prayer. Feels like God's not listening to him, not hearing him. He hath enclosed my ways with hewn stone. He hath made my paths crooked. He was unto me a bear lying in wait, and as a lion in secret places. He hath turned aside my ways and pulled me in pieces. He hath made me desolate. He feels that no matter what he does, he is in a losing battle here. And he's terribly sad. There's one of Lenore's goofy movies that we watched. There's a line in there, and it just cracks me up. And this lady's there, and she says, just remember, no matter how bad things get, they can always get worse. Thanks for that cheering up, all right? Doesn't that just kind of get you going here, all right? But there's something that happens in Jeremiah as he's talking, and we can't stop here at verse 19. We need to move on, but let's look at verse 21. He said, this I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. He went from misery, his misery, to his mercy. That's where he changed. And it's all in his perspective. What is hope? What is hope? That's what he talks about here. This I recall to my mind, therefore have I hope. I heard this man, he was an editor in this newspaper. I can't remember what his name was, but I wrote down his definition, the pessimistic's definition of the word hope. And this is what it is: a pathological belief in the occurrence of the impossible. Is that a pessimistic attitude or what? The great A.W., and not the great A.W. Rush, all right? A.W. Tozer made this definition for hope. He said, the divine alchemy that transmutes the base metal of adversity into gold. That's what hope is. Hope is understanding that there is something there, and we place our hope where? Our hope needs to be in God. All right, and that's not well, I hope so, like somebody hopes to win the lottery, but our hope, our trust, our faith that where we can place ourselves. I'm sorry, Ian? Yeah, but it's we know that we can trust God, and that's where he is here. All right? Faith is in this hope here. He says, this I recall to my mind, therefore have I hope. Unbelief causes us to look at God through our circumstances. The first 19 verses here, Jeremiah is looking at God, especially in verses 7 down to verse 11. He's looking at God through his circumstances. And if we do that, we miss out because our perspective is wrong. Faith enables us to look at our circumstances through the reality of God. How do we look at things? What glass do we use to see things? I got a couple different pair of glasses, all right? Which ones are the clearest? And that's essentially, that's what we're doing here, is what is the perspective that we look at things. So how do we look at my circumstances? Do I look at God through my circumstances? My circumstances are bad, therefore God doesn't care. Or do I look at my circumstances as how God is doing something here? And it's really neat how Jeremiah turns from this. He's still weeping, he's still sad, don't get me wrong. But he switches what his viewpoint is. I read this little, it's not really a poem, but it's kind of like a poem. I'm gonna read it to you. It says, look at yourself and you'll be depressed. On a side note, I think that the majority, not all, there are some things that are chemical imbalance and so forth, but I think the majority of people that suffer from depression is because they're just focused on themselves, all right? But anyway, listen to this. Look at yourself and you'll be depressed. Look at circumstances and you'll be distressed. Look at the Lord and you will be blessed. Psalm chapter 46 and verse 1 says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. My refuge. What's a refuge? It's where you go to hide. It's where you go to what is safe. You got a little kid that is scared. Where does that little kid go? The little kid goes to you. It wraps his arms around your legs or something like that. We had our old dog named Gunther, and he was a fantastic dog unless there was thunder. All right? We had him at the back of the house. We didn't lock our door for 15 years. Because he was 135 pounds, and if anybody came into the yard, any car pulled into the driveway, he'd bark. We knew somebody was there. Even my best friend, he said he loved Gunther and he would wrestle with Gunther when I was there. But if I wasn't there, he wouldn't go around the back of the house. Don't know why, all right? But Gunther, if it was storming, he was allowed in our back hallway, and that's it. We didn't, because he had hair, it would go everywhere, so he was allowed just in the back hallway. Well, the dog had it figured out. He's kind of like kids, really. He figured if he laid in the kitchen and his leg was still in the back hallway, everything was fine, all right? But he wouldn't cross it. He never, ever went down the basement. One day it was thundering. Now, you got to understand, our bedroom is at the very far end of the house. It's as far away from the kitchen as you can possibly get. And the thunder is thundering away there, and I'm asleep, and all of a sudden there's this tongue licking my face. It wasn't Lenore. It was the dog, all right? But where did he go? Where was his refuge? His refuge, oh, I'm scared of the thunder, okay? Big 135-pound dog. But that's what a refuge is. That God is our refuge. He is where we can go, where we can trust. He is our refuge. He is our strength. If the troubles are, we need to turn to God. It needs to be instant. It needs to be reflex that when there's a problem, we turn to God. We turn to God. Look at verse 22 here. It's still Lamentations, chapter 3. Is it of the Lord's mercies that we are not, or it is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. God's compassions don't fail. He knows what we are going through. Verse 23, they are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. Does that remind you of anything? The hymn, great is thy faithfulness, comes from this verse, all right? And it comes from Lamentations, where Jeremiah is, woe is me, God has forsaken me, until he changes his perspective as to how he's looking there in verse number 21. This I recall to my mind, therefore have I hope. You know what? I'm going to change it, and I'm going to look. I know this. I forgot this over in verse 7 down to verse 11. But this I know. I know that I can trust God, because God is my refuge and my strength, a very present help in time of trouble. The Lord is good, verse 25, unto them that wait for him, to the soul that seeketh him. It is good that a man should both hope and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. I need to wait on the Lord. I can trust the Lord. Our circumstances change, all right? Our view of these circumstances will even change over time. What we look at now and think is bleak and is terrible, when we see how God has worked that out, we can look and think, well, those circumstances weren't as bad as what I thought. And our mind can change on those circumstances. Think of Joseph. I love Joseph. You know I love Joseph. One of my favorite character from the Old Testament, all right? But there's Joseph. Do you think that things were peachy keen when he is accused of rape, and he did the most honorable thing he could do and beeline out of there as fast as he possibly could, and he gets thrown in jail for it? And then he after he tells the butler and the baker what their dreams meant, you know, remember me while I'm here. I'm not supposed to be here. And the one guy, well, he dies. And the other guy, there he goes, right back to his position, you know, of being the cupbearer for the king. And what's he do? He forgets him for 2 years. Do you think those situations, do you think those circumstances that Joseph was under look like, well, you know, someday I'm going to be second in command of this country? Do you think he ever thought that? No, but he was still faithful. You know why? Because God was his refuge and strength. How about Ruth? Brother Sean loves the book of Ruth. That's his favorite book. But think of Ruth. Here she is. She's a Moabite. They got a curse on them from God right from the get-go as a nation. Not as individuals, but as a nation. And here's Ruth walking around in a field, picking up one little stalk at a time. Oh, there's a little bit of barley on that. And there's a little bit of oats on that, or whatever. She's just picking up one little thing at a time. Do you think that she thought, well, these circumstances, well, they're no big. One of these days, I'm going to actually be the part owner of this whole farm. It's going to be half mine. She didn't think of that. She didn't think of that, but she stayed faithful to God through her circumstances. Our circumstances change, but God never does. God never changes. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 8, it says, Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. It's even clearer. If that isn't as clear enough for you, that's as clear enough for me, but if that isn't clear enough for you, you know what Malachi chapter 3 verse 6 says? For I am the Lord, I change not. Let's make it clear here. God says, I don't change. I change not, therefore ye sons of Jacob are not consumed. What glass do we choose to look through to see what our circumstances are, to see where we are at? In verse number 25 here in Lamentations, it said, the Lord is good unto them that wait for him, to the soul that seeketh him. Here he is, and he's waiting there on God, all right? And he's telling the people, zip down to verse number 40. He says, let us search and try our ways and turn again to the Lord. He's been preaching this for 40 years. These people need to turn to the Lord. When everything went wrong, he took his eyes for a while off of looking at things through God's perspective and put them on himself, and I would have been worse than Jeremiah. Probably all of us would have. This was a godly man. But it got to him. And should he ever give up? No. Because, verse 21, this I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. I can remember what God has for me. We need to let us search and try our ways and turn again unto the Lord. Draw nigh unto God. James chapter 4 verse 8 says, draw nigh unto God and he will draw nigh unto you. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners. Purify your hearts, ye double-minded. We need to draw nigh unto God. God is faithful. Great is thy faithfulness. God is faithful no matter how we feel or what we see. God sees it from the other side. And I'm not saying it's easy to always trust when things are going wrong. It could not have been easy for Ruth. Going to a country that she was not part of. Going to a country where the people are already told Moabites are bad. Going to a country with a miserable mother-in-law. Call me Mara. Look what God's done to me. All right? This is who she's going to live with. This is who she says, your God will be my God. Where they bury you, they're going to bury me. I'm going to be true to you because of the God that you have taught me about before. Naomi took her eye off of God. Just like Jeremiah took his eye off of God. Although Naomi took it off for a lot longer than Jeremiah did. Jeremiah finally says, you know what? This I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. Sometimes we need to trust when things aren't going wrong or things aren't going right. And Brother Ian could tell you this story better than me. He's told it to me a couple times, but different times when he's flying an airplane and he got caught in the Aurora Borealis, looking at the Aurora Borealis. And he couldn't tell which way the plane was moving. He was, he's looking at the lights. Oh, look at the pretty lights. and somebody told him, forget about the lights, stop looking at the lights, look at your instruments. He didn't want to trust his instruments. He said, well, they're doing the wrong thing. No, they're not. And he had to trust his instruments. That's what we need to do with God. When it seems like it's the wrong thing to do, but we know that this is what the Bible says, we need to trust God. Because God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in the time of trouble. There's three things I want us to look at. Number one is verse 23. It says, they are new every morning, great is thy faithfulness. God is always faithful. Always. Doesn't matter what we see. Doesn't matter what we think. Our opinion can change. God's does not. Our circumstances, we can look at them and we can misunderstand what our circumstances are, like flying that airplane. I think I'm going down. No, you're not. You're going up. I think I'm going up. No, you're not. You're going down. I think I'm turning left. Turning right. Nothing made sense. All right? And if you hadn't listened to that one fella, we wouldn't have to listen to Ian over and over again tell these stories. Just kidding. But my point is this. We need to trust God because God is always faithful. Verse 31. For the Lord will not cast off forever. God doesn't cast off his people and forget them. It may seem sometimes like we are alone. You're never alone. God's there. He's faithful. We can trust him. And the third one is verse 32. But though he cause grief, yet will he have compassion according to the multitude of his mercies. In the midst of our pain, we know that he loves us. And what he's doing, Romans chapter 8, verse 28, and we know that all things work together for good to them who are the called according to his purpose. All right. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Let's pray.